You've received that email like 1,000 times. Change your password again, change your password. Keeping track of the passwords is so complicated. If you don't do it effectively, it increases the risk that you might be the victim of some sort of cyber crime or identity theft. And as you can imagine, there is a ton of research and innovation and testing and technology to try and improve the way our data is protected. One of the big ideas is around biometrics, which for a long time existed in the world of sci-fi, but now many of us see it and use it in our day-to-day life. And so we're going to focus on that and the future of biometrics. Our guest is Amisha Parikh. She is Vice President of Cybersecurity and Intelligence Solutions at Mastercard. And she joins us now to talk about what are biometrics and what will be the role they play in the future to protect Canadians and their data. Hello there, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Bruce. I'm happy to be here.
I am sure you see in your role the data on fraud, but you also probably hear it anecdotally. When something happens in your friend group, they're like, I can't believe it's back in America. I was at an event on Sunday, and a friend of mine talked about going to a bar. He used his debit card to pay for a drink, and the next day noticed that A, he had been returned a debit card that was not his, and B, that there was a $1,000 charge on that debit card. So something happened with a bait and switch. Someone had observed him with his PIN. These kinds of stories are ubiquitous. What are the ways in which financial services institutions like your own are trying to tackle this issue?
Yeah, no, and it's a great example and probably highlights a number of things that we all kind of worry about on a day-to-day basis, right? And that's we're in this environment now where we almost need to take extra steps to prove that we are who we're saying we are, right? And from the standpoint of financial institutions and merchants in the ecosystem, that's a big challenge that they're facing, right? That you're coming in and you're presenting that payment card. How do I know that you're the person whose name is here? And as our ecosystem is evolving and more of what we're doing is also online, it makes it even harder, right? Because you're not seeing the face behind the card. And so I think that's where we've seen, and I think everybody can probably attest to the fact that we have lots of things in the digital ecosystem to try to authenticate us, because we'll say from a payment standpoint, authentication is a really, really important thing that we need to ensure around security. In the digital ecosystem, though, when you think about authentication, you're like, okay, well, I've got to do a password. Passwords are annoying. I think most people can agree to the fact that they're annoying. I've got to remember a bajillion of them in addition to like everything else I have to do every day. Then I have to remember that to update them. And then there's this anxiety around, not only do I have a password, it can't be like, my kid's name or the name of my puppy. It's got to be something strong. And what does strong even mean once you start to think about all that? So as we think about the payments ecosystem and, multi-factor authentication and this evolution of kind of where we've come to, there's this focus on how do we make this frictionless, but more secure, right? And that feels like a bit of a dichotomy. Yeah. But it also lends to why biometric authentication is really, really important when we talk about the evolution.
How do you define that word? What is actually included? I mean, it makes me think of fingerprints, and I have a voice print at one of my institutions. I think my phone knows my face. How do you define biometrics?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question around the definition of biometrics. And it's really leveraging technology to be able to identify things like facial recognition, your fingerprint, your iris in your eye, right? I think you talked about voice. Voice is an interesting one because, as we think about the evolution of generative AI and the ability to be able to replicate things like your voice or your, just an image of you, there are things that are difficult to replicate, which is actually the things that are uniquely on your person. And that's where I think when we think about the definition of biometrics, it's the things that are uniquely you and only you carry around with you. And how do we now identify those things via technology and some of the technology that you carry around? Because we're taking away the password and moving that authentication to the person. And
There is a significant amount of activity that most of us do on a device in which we're not showing the credit card anywhere. We're shopping on Amazon. I happen to shop on Amazon on a desktop. So sure, I had a password to get onto that desktop, but I don't currently have a biometric solution to ensure that that transaction was authorized by me. How do you do it when transactions live on all these different devices that we can have access to?
That's a great question. And I think you called out that mobile is sort of this first step, right? So people have this familiarity with, maybe you've done some banking online and your banking app allows you to have mobile authentication. But then you're right, when you log in on your laptop, it doesn't have that. And I think at Mastercard, we have a commitment, to finding better, safer, easier ways of keeping transactions and sensitive data safe. And so we actually have a new service that can help resolve, this friction and vulnerability. It's biometric authentication services, but it leverages existing safety and security standards that are already built into personal devices like mobile phones, but also like your laptop, like your tablet. And it allows you to enable that type of authentication on all of those devices.
Where is the science headed? So you referenced AI and the challenge that might be on voice, because AI might be able to replicate my voice. What are some of the big themes, the big questions that people are trying to answer, such that there's solutions here that are sustainable over time?
Yeah, no, that's a very good one too, because I think when we start to think about technology, so AI is an example, when we think about innovation, we recognize that to progress forward, we need to embrace these technologies, right? And there's a lot of power in terms of they can help businesses, how they can help consumers, how they can help people in their day-to-day activities. You think about things like travel and a travel itinerary. You can use a chat GPT and have an itinerary in 45 seconds. It can help with things like there's a new version of ChatGPT that recently launched, which now almost has like a tutoring type of functionality. We can help with education, a lot of power for corporations as well, a lot of power in terms of thinking about predicting behaviors and understanding consumers better. But at the same time, the same things that are making us more informed and are giving us the harnessing the power of this technology, it's also making the bad actors in the ecosystem powerful. Right. And so I think there's a bit of a balance in terms of how do we leverage these tools for good? How do we leverage them to benefit us as a society? How do we take that technology and help us to, we see that leaps and bounds in terms of the acceleration of the adoption of these technologies. But how do we also, and I think that question is, how do we also use the same technology to stay a step ahead of the adversary? How can we use this to mitigate risk? How can we use this to identify and predict fraudulent behavior? So things like AI tools, we have innovation in terms of leveraging this to have a predictive nature with a pretty high degree of accuracy to say, based on certain patterns of behavior, this transaction appears fraudulent. Because when we think about in isolation, things like an identity attribute or a specific action, in isolation, a lot of these fraudsters are very smart and the actual attributes themselves are real, right? It is a real attribute, but it's linking the way in which all of these individual attributes are linked together, which is really also important to understand, and understanding how all of those link together to say, hey, this is fraudulent because of the way that we're looking at how I was authenticated. It might have been an email address that's real. That email address was created last week. Right. So I think it's balancing that.
What are the guardrails on privacy? And I'll give you a very real world example. I attended a confidential meeting with 70 attendees from across the country. Someone had invited Otter AI. And so after the meeting, every single person received a summary of this confidential meeting, which I'm certain was not consistent with the privacy protocols of the host of said meeting. How do we find the balance here so that sort of thing doesn't happen, and more broadly, people's privacy is protected?
Yeah, no, so this is I think top of mind, I know here at Mastercard for us all the time, the safety and security and privacy around data is of the utmost importance. And I think it's also top of mind for consumers. It's top of mind for financial institutions. Everybody wants to ensure that there's trust, and part of what's building trust is ensuring that the information that you've shared it has privacy guardrails around it. And then there's also, I mean, the protection against the bad actors in the ecosystem who are breaching some of that data, right? And the concerns around those guardrails. So I think there's two things kind of to touch upon there. One is around just the technology ecosystem and ensuring that we are safeguarding against things like data breaches, that we have cyber hygiene in place, that we're thinking about ensuring both from a corporate standpoint, but also as individual consumers, that we're doing things like, putting in all our updates on our phones regularly and patches on our computers, that we're regularly updating our passwords, that we're just being mindful of like our own cyber hygiene practices. I think it's like a really important piece. And then I think as organizations, I think the awareness of exactly what you said, kind of the guardrails around information dissemination and the ease at which things can be replicated, shared, disseminated, and understanding that, so that not only are we being very transparent about how data can be used, but very, very cognizant about what is being shared, recognizing that the authorization of data access needs to always be safe and secure.
Very interesting stuff. Amisha, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And for giving me the phrase cyber hygiene. I promise I will demonstrate good cyber hygiene. Amisha Parikh is VP of Cybersecurity and Intelligence Solutions at Mastercard. She joined us to talk about some of the things going on in the cybersecurity space, including biometrics.